Today we are talking with Stephen Hinshaw, who is a distinguished professor of psychology at the University of California at Berkeley. His work focuses on developmental psychopathology, clinical interventions with children and adolescents, and mental illness stigma. He's authored more than 415 articles and 13 books, including a primer on ADHD that we researched and wrote together. I've been so looking forward to talking with you, Stephen, particularly about a subject that is part of our mission, which is the need to diagnose girls with ADHD early. And you have done absolutely seminal research about this topic. I wondered if we could start with that, if you could briefly describe the longitudinal studies that you did.
Back in the 1990s, my team and I decided to get bold, and we wrote a big application to the National Institute of Mental Health to use our summer camp methods, where we have a day camp for 6 weeks. We have counselors, teachers, and observers. We interview kids, do testing, interview and videotape families, and put a whole lot of information together that isn't just one-on-one in the clinic. It's a naturalistic, ecologically valid way of understanding kids. Could we apply that method to girls with ADHD and neurotypical girls of the same age range, same race and ethnicity, who served as our controls? The government said, let's try again. We reapplied and got the top score of any grant in the country that year. We got data on 140 girls with ADHD, very carefully diagnosed, and 90 neurotypical comparisons. We had promised the families before the orientations, before our summer camps in 1997, 98, and 99, we want to follow your daughters the rest of their lives. We can only get a grant 5 years at a time, so we're going to have to publish and keep in touch with you all. Long story short, we published a lot of what we think are important findings, got a 5-year grant, another and another. Now for 25 years, we've been following the Berkeley girls with ADHD longitudinal study. They're all in their 30s. We've had over 90% of the participants, up to 95%, come back for each wave because we're relentless and because they got a free program. We treated them and their families with a lot of respect.
Fantastic.
We published a lot. We're very interested in the trajectories of girls with ADHD. Like boys with ADHD, girls with ADHD, both those with the combined presentation, a lot of impulsivity, hyperactivity, inattention, and those girls with the more purely inattentive variety had academic problems. They had trouble making and keeping friends. They were in special ed more than their neuro comparisons. We did a lot of observations and testing. These are girls who on neuropsychological tests, executive functions, working memory, planning, shifting set, making a new plan when the first one doesn't go well, had immaturity which persisted over time. In fact, to move ahead into adolescence, their late teens and early 20s, later 20s, and now their 30s, these are girls who didn't have, except for nicotine, as much exposure to illicit substances and alcohol use abuse as many boy samples. On the other hand, during the adolescent years and beyond, lots of depression, not as much delinquency as boys, and a very alarming trend that many of them, especially if they'd also had early trauma in their lives. ADHD is really heritable. Genes matter a lot, but early physical or sexual abuse or neglect contributed even more than the genetic underpinnings to cutting, burning, self-mutilation, and attempted suicide. Over a third of the girls in our sample who had childhood ADHD, very stringently diagnosed, and had received trauma had made an attempt on their lives by their late 20s, compared to about 1 in 7 of the girls with biologically determined ADHD who had not received such trauma. Also, very high rates of unplanned pregnancy and 3 times the risk of having been sexually assaulted by partners, boyfriends, etc.
A heightened risk. I
A
just want
heightened
to
risk
for that
for the
because
girls with ADHD,
what was the
whether or not traumatized. Without early recognition and appropriate treatment, during the teen years, low academic performance and disidentification with school and being rejected or bullied by peers were 2 big factors in predicting some of these really difficult long-term outcomes. It's great to reduce symptoms of ADHD, but promoting academic success and success with peers is crucial as well.
So it sounds like you're saying that untreated ADHD can lead to great harm
That's right.
in future years. But weren't any of these girls treated?
We didn't do a clinical trial. Other studies I've done, we randomly assign some of the kids to get medication, some to get intensive behavior therapy or not. This is a naturalistic study. We took the girls as we found them in the community. Some received medication, although back in the 90s, medication often wasn't done for girls as carefully as it may be now. Some of the girls got counseling, some got parent training. But these interventions were rather inconsistent and not very strong. The
But
other problem is when you do a naturalistic study like this, who got treated and who didn't? Maybe the ones with the most severe cases of ADHD got treated, or those whose families had better health care insurance. It's hard to know unless you do a randomized study if treatment is just a proxy for how severe it is or treatment is. The point is that we know from randomized studies that boys and girls both respond to medications for ADHD if you get the right medication and the right dose.
big
Boys
if.
and girls both respond to reward-based behavioral programs at home and in school. Once you get into the teen years, boys and girls in adult years, women and men respond to cognitive behavior therapy, anger management, organizational skills, those kinds of things. Why is it taken so long for researchers and clinicians to recognize that girls have ADHD? This is a long-standing myth that girls, it must be something, it must be anxiety, it must be a learning problem. Girls really don't get ADHD. In fact, they do. Not
In
quite as often as boys, but they do.
Steve, in your time studying this, have you seen us making progress in recognizing girls with ADHD like we didn't used to?
Back in the day, when I was in grad school, we learned that there was about 10 boys for every girl with ADHD. We now know from representative samples, it's about 2 or 2.5 boys for every girl because there are better recognition signs that clinicians can follow. There is better research. Girls get diagnosed later because girls are more likely than boys to have this more purely inattentive form of ADHD. It's more subtle. They're not disrupting classrooms. They're not throwing spit.
What's the average
B,
age that girls get diagnosed versus boys?
we don't have fabulous data on that, but for boys, the average age would be about 7, 8, or 9 in the early grade school years. For girls, the average age is much later in childhood, with a huge percentage of girls not getting diagnosed till high school or even adulthood. We have very recent data from national sources in the US from big insurance panels that the biggest jump in ADHD diagnoses over the last 10 years has been in people 30 to 50,
So
and
interesting.
predominantly in women who were pretty much ignored and denied having ADHD diagnoses. Girls have a more subtle presentation on average. Many teachers and clinicians and researchers think it really isn't a gal thing, it's only a guy thing. In fact, if you do an evidence-based assessment, you got to get a really good history. You got to get those milestones early. You have to know if there's been trauma. You have to know if there's speech and language issues, if there's motor issues, if there's learning problems. These things can look like ADHD, so you got to rule them out, but they can also accompany ADHD. What isn't going to work is 12 or 15 minutes in a general pediatrician's office with a pediatrician who has not really had any specialty training in this except for maybe a 6-week rotation back in medical school or the first year of being a medical resident. Developmental and behavioral pediatricians, child and adolescent psychiatrists. These are the people who are trained to look for the signs of ADHD before middle school and high school and all the hormones of puberty and peer rejection that occurs before it's really late in the game.
Do you think a lot of girls are getting misdiagnosed? They don't get diagnosed with ADHD, but rather with the comorbidities like.
Certainly been the case for decades. I think we're seeing a shift. We don't have the kind of national good data that the Scandinavian countries do. We don't have wiretaps in pediatricians' offices to see exactly what's going on. But with better medical education, better pediatrics and psychiatric education, and with research papers coming out now every day that ADHD in girls is real, You've got to diagnose it carefully. And when you do, you've got to really get these girls treatment because the long-term outcomes often different for girls with ADHD than boys. Many girls with ADHD can and do thrive and recover later in life, but the overall picture is lots of low self-esteem, lots of depression, and way too much sexual violence, unplanned pregnancy, and serious attempts on their lives. Because for a girl with ADHD, I'm supposed to be learning. I'm supposed to be social. Why does nobody like me? Why have my teachers said I'm not trying hard my whole life? Why do I argue with my parents constantly? It's this cumulative toll when ADHD is under-recognized or mistaken for something else and the good treatments aren't given. This is the big culprit in some of these really difficult long-term outcomes.
Before you said that it's 2 to 1 boys to girls, right? In grade school, perhaps, should it be 1 to 1? Is it
We'll go back for a little lesson in biology. If you are conceived before you're born and you have an XX, double X, you're a genetic female, versus XY, genetic male. From about the 5th or 6th week of being in utero on, if you have the XY, that little puny Y chromosome that only has about 50 genes on it, the X has a couple of thousand genes on it, that Y chromosome says, start secreting androgens, testosterone, and you become a genetic male. That androgen slows brain development in males compared to females.
Wow.
During the first few years of life, girls are more verbal. They're more pro-social. They care more about what adults think. So it's little wonder that for autism spectrum disorders, it's at least 3 to 1 boys to girl. For ADHD, it's 2 or 2.5. For Tourette, a movement disorder, it's about 4 to 1. For
fascinating?
very early, age 5 and below, serious aggression, it's about 7 to 1. Boys are more vulnerable than girls to early neurodevelopmental conditions. But for ADHD, 2.3 or 2.4 to 1, that's not 10 to 1 like I learned. Females have been ignored in basic animal research for years. Most research on basic animal physiology is done with the males because females have estrus and their hormones are wacky. They're perceived to be abnormal and deviant, right? This is from basic biological research into clinical and human research. There are going to be more boys than girls with ADHD, but not nearly as many more as we once thought. Girls are more likely than boys to have the more hidden type, the inattentive presentation. That's the more persistent type.
But are you saying if it's now 2 to 1 girls being diagnosed, and that seems to be the prevalence,
Right.
that we've made that much progress?
We have made that progress if you believe the national data where you ask random samples of families across the country, and they're reporting now that their daughters are getting diagnosed. But are their daughters getting the evidence-based treatments? The majority of kids with ADHD in the United States may or may not receive medication, about 2/3 do, but often the medications that are given are write a prescription and call me in 6 months, not the dosing, not the trials. With the medications used to treat ADHD, you can know in a couple, 3, 4 weeks what dose is working and which type is working. It takes month after month for an SSRI or other medications for other conditions. If Ritalin, methylphenidate, the Concertas of the world don't work, then the Adderalls and amphetamines might work. We don't have a formula right now to predict, given your symptom profile, you need this dose of that kind of medication. We've got to do some systematic trial and error. All too seldom are parent management training and coordinated home and school interventions where teachers get to be part of that reward system, working with parents, texting back how the kid did in school that day on their targets, adding the good check marks they get to the reward program at home. These are effective treatments, but very few kids with ADHD get them.
Just to clarify, we're catching girls, but we're not catching them as early as
Not catching them as early as boys. The big spike is in women who have been delayed for many years in getting the diagnosis. Even when we're catching them, the general pediatric world basically has prescription pads for medications. Pediatricians aren't trained in behavioral treatments, cognitive behavioral treatments. We need much more collaboration among school psychologists, clinical psychologists, pediatricians to get what we know really works best. The combination of medication and these behavioral and cognitive behavioral treatments overall produce the best results.
How do we get girls to be diagnosed as early as boys? Do you have advice for schools, parents to?
The $64 question. Number one, teachers need better training on what ADHD is and is not. Public school classrooms are crowded. Public schools are underfunded.
Teachers are scared to bring that up with parents.
That's right. And parents who may not realize that their daughter has ADHD may have to get that parent-teacher conference set up and say, what's going on? If teachers have the stereotype that ADHD is the Tom Sawyer syndrome, the boy, the white middle class boy who won't paint the picket fence because he wants to mess around all the time, ADHD in girls can look like distractibility, not following multi-part directions, seeming not to listen, having sometimes, even in kindergarten, group circle time, not paying attention. If I were czar, I would get undergraduates at major universities to volunteer in schools and help teachers with observations to see who is and who is not off task, because that can help. And doctors, pediatricians, in collaboration with other specialists, get that developmental history. Maybe there is a speech and hearing problem. One reason kid can't pay attention to multi-part directions is they may have a subtle hearing loss. Sometimes subtle seizure disorders can look just like inattentive ADHD.
Wow.
So you need to do a thorough medical evaluation. You need to get a really good developmental history, and you need to get really good input from school and home about what the day-to-day routine looks like. ADHD is a funny name. It's inaccurate. It's not an attention deficit. Many people with ADHD, including girls and women, if they get engaged in an activity they're really good at, and really they're hyper-focused. They forget lunch, they forget dinner, they forget everything else. It's called hyperfocus.
It's almost manic.
ADHD is a condition in which it's hard to regulate your attention as the day changes, as task changes. You get stuck in one mode and not in the other. So it's really more of a regulatory disorder. In that way, ADHD is consistent inconsistency. Teachers and parents need better education about that.
I want to ask you a personal question that I don't think I've ever asked you. In the 1990s, I don't think a whole lot of researchers were looking into this. What got you interested, focused on girls with ADHD in those years?
I've always been interested in sex and gender differences in psychopathology. Why do women around the world have twice as much depression as men? But for bipolar disorder, it seems about 50-50. Why would ADHD be 10 to 1 boy to girl? Is that really true? And I'm enough of a skeptic to think, let's challenge some of the predominant beliefs. When we would run our boys programs, there'd be a few girls that applied every year, but we could never take them because we didn't want to have 75 boys and 4 girls getting outnumbered by the boys. It took a shifted set. Let's go for broke and get the NIMH to fund a really systematic look at girls. It's fascinating when you do work like this. Anything you find will be a discovery, but you want to make sure that it's valid. But it's been a real learning experience about how girls and boys can and do both have ADHD, but their pathways diverge because girls tend to internalize more than boys when they're doing something wrong and they're not meeting expectations, which leads to this devastating low self-esteem, depression, cutting.
Wow. And you're still in touch with these girls, and they're in their 30s?
All of them. We just finished our 5th follow-up, and we're starting to analyze those data. Some of the girls, now women, are thriving. And of course, we'd like to find the formula.
If they're in your group, they know they have ADHD and they've been thinking about it and coping with it.
Right. We've done with a subset of them, qualitative interview them for 2 hours about what it felt like as a girl to have ADHD. What does it feel like now? If you were engaging in self-harmful behavior, why? And why did you start? And why did you stop? Getting girls' and women's voices is a big part of the picture here, as well as collecting quantitative data and realizing the barriers to treatment. It took the 5th doctor I went to I gave up on thinking I had ADHD as a teenager. Then I went to college and it was tougher than I thought. It took doctor number 5 to say, remember, you had that ADHD diagnosis as a girl. It can be a revelation when that happens, as you well know.
Not to introduce a whole broader conversation, but we definitely need some kind of reform. I don't know if we need more doctors, more, in general, more developmental psychologists. Something in the system is so wrong when a parent with a child with serious emotional or cognitive problems cannot find help, right? Most
And
people are relying on the pediatrician.
if you're in a rural area, there aren't specialists around. If you're in an urban area, the waiting lists are a year or two long. We
Insurance.
don't have an equitable system. We need more fundamental training for GPs for adults, general pediatricians for kids, and we need much better collaboration across school, clinical psychologists and pediatricians so that the wealth of knowledge we have about treatments can be applied much better and much more equitably.
I know we promised that we would just take a half an hour of your time, and we're coming close to the end here. Cynthia, do you have any questions that I forgot to ask?
That was very interesting, especially learning about the X and Y chromosome and why it's laid down genetically that men
Yep.
have more issues. Did you ever figure out why women are depressed more often?
First 10 years of life is the risk period for boys for neurodevelopmental conditions. The second 10 years of life, once puberty hits ever earlier, girls are now at risk for cutting, self-harm, depression, eating symptoms, which is both the biological press of puberty and these totally unrealistic expectations we have of girls to be perfect all the time. That would be part 2 lecture for another time.
You're wonderful. Thank you so much for making the time for us, Steve.
So thanks, and as always, great questions, and good luck moving forward.
We believe all girls with ADHD should get a fair start in life by getting diagnosed by age 8. Visit us at www.findtheadhdgirls.org. Thank you.